The saloon's back room reeked of broken promises and cheap perfume when he kicked the door open. A scream braided with the shriek of breaking glass. The chandelier swung like a pendulum struck by panic. One woman, her skirt torn, her boots muddied, a ribbon of blood running from the corner of her lip, was being sold like a horse at auction. Men laughed, counted and slurred offers, while a town clerk, red-faced and official, banged a stamp down as if it could seal a life. Then a figure filled the door. He moved through the smoke as if he'd been carved out of it, tall, wrapped in a duster speckled with desert grit, a hat shadowing most of his face. No one saw him come. They felt the room tilt toward him. 2 gunshots cut the laughter. Wood splintered. A chair skittered. He was a blur where he needed to be. A rifle across his shoulder, boots thudding, eyes narrowed like a man who'd measured every step of a lifetime by the length of a gun. He wasn't announced. He didn't have to be. Staccato orders turned to silence as the outlaw moved. He disarmed a man in a single fluent motion, wrists a twist. The man dropped his pistol, a gasp, a broken tooth. Another lunged. The outlaw's boot met his ribs. Paper money skittered like frantic insects across the floor. A brass badge flashed. A sheriff's star fell under a boot. Someone tried to leap the bar. The outlaw's hand, fast and calm, caught a thrown bottle and smashed it against a beam. The shard hissed like a snake, and the man who'd thrown it yelped. She was hunched in the corner, elbows to knees, breathing too fast. When she looked up, their eyes met. For one cracked second, the world shrank to the space between them, a face haunted by fear and something that looked like relief. His face was cut and shadowed. His jaw had the map of old fights. A wanted poster pinned crooked on the wall behind him read, "Elias Cutter, wanted, dead or alive, reward $5,000. The paper's ink had run in places where rain had hit. He'd killed 17 men, the poster said in town talk. He rode like the desert owned him. But now he was kneeling in the dirt like a man who'd taught himself to be careful with a life. He didn't take the reward that day. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, calloused and quick. Not tender show, but a calculation made in the space of a pulse, and pulled her up as if he'd been saving her a lifetime. 10 minutes, he said into her ear, low as a furnace. Another scream. Footsteps ran the boardwalk outside. The town's clock choked at the top of the hour. Somewhere horses stamped like thunder held in a throat. He had 3 bullets in his belt. He had 2 enemies who wanted the woman back and a sheriff who wanted him dead. He had one reason to stay alive that he didn't understand. Her face did something to the part of him that had been smoothed into hard edges. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he had killed 17 men. But in 60 seconds she would owe him her life, and he would owe her something he couldn't name. The first 30 seconds had been a blast of violence and sound. The outlaw's calves were long, his motions economy. He disarmed and cradled without flourish. He couldn't speak a name. He used no titles. The men who'd been trading her stepped back, slick with panic and greed. One man, slick hair, city suit, a face like a legal ledger, pinned his hands into his pockets and produced a paper. "You think you can steal her?" He spat. "She isn't for sale," the outlaw said. Guns had barked before the words. Glass was still raining from the chandelier. The outlaw's fingers, calloused, smelling faintly of gun oil and leather, kept brushing the left pocket of his duster. He'd been doing it in the saloon and in the blank dark of the stables afterward. A habit? A talisman? He didn't know. He only knew the touch steadied him. The woman, May Marlowe, although he didn't learn her name for a few minutes, had a look like someone who'd been sold to the highest bidder before. Her fingers trembled. They smelled of whiskey and something sweet. When the outlaw turned his face toward her, she saw the wanted poster on the wall, with his likeness and the reward price. Her eyebrows arched as if stocking up questions. She asked the most important one, Why'd you come for me? He answered with an uncomplicated cowboy shrug and a plan. Outside in the alley, he counted each step the way he counted bullets. 10 minutes until the nearest posse, he judged, because he'd had a reason to know how long it took for law to smell blood. He saddled their horses with hands that had known every knot and lash. his movements clean and fast. He found 2 bullets and 3 minutes of silence and gave her both. "I have 3 bullets," he said once they were moving, not to her question but to the universe. "I can give you 2 if I must. The third's for me." "Why?" she asked, voice strangled. He kept touching the left pocket. The horse beneath him smelled of sweat and hay. The town shrank behind them. The outlaw's silhouette, framed by a sky the color of old metal, bore a poster's scrawl across it in May's mind. "Wanted, dead or alive." She flinched. "Because I don't believe in being sold," he said. They rode with dust swallowing the trail. He had 10 minutes to outrun a posse of men who knew the country better than he did because he had a talent for muscle memory and misdirection, skills born of being hunted. He led them through brush, where a rider less practiced would cage his horse. He moved like a man who could read animal unease, a rabbit's alarm, a hawk's shift, a horse's restlessness. He took tracks that told him where the dry creek bed would hide a run and where rocks would silence hoofbeats. If a town official had hired trackers, they wouldn't find him until the outlaw wanted them to. The first pursuers found distance, not a trail. May's breath came in shallow little hiccups. Blood had dried at the corner of her lip and cracked like old paint. She kept pressing a hand to a wound in her side, an injury the outlaw had bandaged with a strip of his shirt. He wrapped it tightly, hands steady, and it was like the world rearranged itself around his fingers. He worked a lockpick into his own mind because he carried always a smuggled set of skills. Lockpicking, first aid, quiet. He'd grown them the way other men grew calluses. They needed to lose anyone whose boots would betray them. He pulled May into a stand of low junipers and cut the reins to let the horses graze. He spoke little. He watched. He kept touching the left pocket. The touch was a thin, persistent question. Why did he do it? What was in that pocket? A photograph, a coin, a note. While he bandaged her, he swore he saw a badge glint on the trail. Sheriff's star, heavy and unmistakable. He was not alone in coming for her. The outlaw's jaw tightened. He had taught himself to be wary of that sort of shine. "How many men?" May asked, voice brittle. "Enough," he answered. 10 minutes, and we find a place that doesn't sell shadows for coin." He gave her a half smile like a promise and something like a lie. They had 15 minutes of daylight before the nearest road would smell their horses with watchers. He counted on his fingers, then erased the count because in his head he was counting bullets, not minutes. The left pocket touch pulled at him like a small illness. He heard the pursuers less than 10 minutes later. A voice called his name, Elias Cutter, made into a rope and thrown. The outlaw's mouth flattened. He rode forward into danger, with the woman tucked behind him like a secret. He moved through gunfire the way one moves through hail, head down, shoulders forward, letting the noise pass. He killed no one that day, but he made sure the pursuers chose their wounds carefully. He used the land like an accomplice. The arroyo swallowed noise, sage scrub confused scent, and the two of them emerged under the long shade of a mesa as if they'd been swallowed and spat out by the earth itself. The badge in his saddlebag wasn't his. He could tell by the smell of leather and the way the metal fit its slot. It wasn't his badge, but it was about to get them both killed if it fell into the wrong hands. His hideout crouched in a hollow not far beyond a ridge. It had been a barn once, now a shelter of boards and patched corrugated iron, the kind of place in which wind liked to learn a tune. Bullet holes pocked the walls like a star map of old nights. There were rust-red stains on the floorboards, and once May noticed them, she could not stop seeing small, sad moons of dried blood. He checked every window with a ritual that would have seemed superstitious if you didn't know the motives. Every 15 minutes, he ran his hand along sills and seams, peering out with the slow, exhaustive patience of a man who expected to be betrayed. He sharpened a knife with a stone until the metal made the sound of a fine thing being made finer. He moved around the small room with a care that belly ached of paranoia. She found the woman's dress in his trunk by accident. It was folded inside oilcloth beneath a bedroll, as if folded away like a debt. The dress was older style, lace at the collar, a faint perfume in the fabric that made her nose ache. May's fingers went over the fabric with a kind of reverence that surprised her. "Whose is it?" she asked, voice too loud in the small room. The outlaw, Elias, tensed, then softened. "My sister's," he said. His voice was bone-deep quiet. "She wore it the night I left this town. She wore it when they framed me." Her eyes narrowed. She turned me in," Elias finished. 3 years ago. I buried her in the desert, or so everyone was told." His fingers stopped at the hem, because the memory of sand and silence and a spade was a thing he still tasted. Every 90 seconds, the story edged the audience toward a new question. Was the sister truly dead? Why would she betray him? Who had the sheriff been working for? The wanted poster in the hideout had been updated. Someone with hatchet hands and ink-stained nerves, had slapped new words across the margins. Reward increased. The hunt wasn't just personal now. It was industrial. May ran a hand through a seam and found a folded banknote and a slip of paper with a name, Harrow. She knew that name, Sheriff Thaddeus Harrow. A man whose reputation had been as shiny as badges and as stained as what sat underneath them. Outside, a gunshot sounded like a lark's last song in the sky. A horse whinnied in the distance. May's fever rose. The outlaw's checks for windows became a rhythm, his own breath a drum. 3 years ago, you buried someone in the desert. Tomorrow you'd have to dig them up, she said, not as a question but a prediction. He didn't answer aloud. The open loops gathered like dust motes waiting for a hand. He'd sworn never to kill again, May thought. She'd heard him say it like a confession, but saving her might cost 5 more lives. Was 1 innocent worth 5 guilty? May's face hardened, as if asking the audience for a verdict. Her question, simple, naive, desperate, pulled a memory from him, the way a child pulls a toy from a trunk. A flashback, short as a match, the night he was framed. 45 seconds compressed to a slice of light. A saloon fight, where a man's face was familiar and then not. The sheriff's badge flashed like sun off a knife, a partner who turned his back. He saw the hand that planted evidence, the cigarette butt in the wrong place, the ledger with someone else's writing. He had been framed. He had been framed by a man who had made himself a sheriff and who loved the taste of control. The real criminal, someone with the power to move men like chess pieces, had not stopped at framing him. The man who had made Elias into a monster had climbed the ladder to law. He now wore a star, polished on Sunday, stained on Monday. Elias's dead partner, Gideon, wasn't dead. Gideon had stood in the dark and watched Elias taken away and turned his back. The betrayal had been thorough. Gideon had been a mirror that had turned away. His reflection now rode with Sheriff Harrow. The dress May had found in the trunk, it had belonged to Lydia Cutter, Elias's sister, whose betrayal had been the stitch that tied the town's narrative. She had turned Elias in for reasons he had to hold like coals. Why would your sister? How could she? May's voice broke. She was afraid, Elias said. Fear makes saints into liars. It makes sisters into witnesses who sign their names under coercion. He jerked his hand to the left pocket, where the thing he'd touched all evening thudded against his hip like a small heart. The audience had been planted a question. The outlaw kept touching that pocket not for superstition, but because in it was proof, a folded town receipt that could upend careers, and also something far smaller and far more private, a small photograph of Lydia laughing at a river. A coin from a place they had agreed would never be named again. The man who framed him was the sheriff heading their way. Harrow had made himself the law and was about to ride this way with Gideon at his side. A bounty hunter, a wiry man with a hawk's face, was dangerously close. The micro cliffhanger yawned. The sound of a distant horse's hoof hammered on wood. May's story unfolded like a map folded too many times. Creases, smudges, secrets. She had watched a man fall dead in the courtyard of the railroad company's office, a murder that had been sealed as an accident. That man had been trying to stop a land grab, trying to expose graft between the railroad baron and the governor. She had seen their faces when the light hit their eyes. She had been the only witness. That made her more dangerous than a gun. It made her a ledger of truth. When kin had sold her body to silence her, they did not know what they'd set loose. The man who had pulled the strings in the shadows was the same man sheltering under a badge, Sheriff Harrow. He had alliances with governor and baron, fingers in every pie. He wanted her dead because she knew 3 names that would break his network. She kept those names because she had the stubbornness of someone who had already run out of concessions. "They've killed 12 people," May said, eyes dark as dry wells. 12 to keep silent. 9 that got in the way of the railroad, 3 that saw too much. They knew I was there when the ledger burned. They knew I could name them all. Elias listened to the tightness in her mouth like a bell. The sheriff's motive unpacked like a map: land, power, silence. He had not only been framed, he had been buried under the town's appetite to tidy problems into graves. Now the same appetite turned hungrily toward May. She knew 3 names. One of Elias's old contacts later told them, in a cheap room where the lamplight looked like confession. They'd killed to keep her quiet. The revelation landed like a hammer. A twist arrived. The sheriff hunting Elias was the same man who wanted her dead. That made their need for alliance not merely convenient, but necessary. The open loop multiplied. Could 2 damaged souls together turn the town toward justice? They learned each other in fragments, in how May flinched when a hand came too close to hers, in the way Elias kept the left pocket habit, in the small, ridiculous rituals that disguised themselves as safety. Intimacy threaded itself through danger, the kiss broken by distant gunfire, the tenderness interrupted by a shout at the ridge. When he taught her to shoot, his voice was patient and exact. He showed her how to breathe with the gun, how to make recoil a thing of rhythm rather than surprise. Chekhov's gun, the rifle he'd given her, was being loaded now in more than one sense. She loaded her revolver under his watch. Her hands were less steady at first, and then steadier, because fear can teach technique fast. She would use it later, and it would matter. The bounty on her head grew, $2,000 slapped against a public notice. The town's hunger promised more teeth. One night, sitting beside a meager fire, he dug a small copper locket from his left pocket and handed it to her. "My ma gave me this," he said. The locket was warm from his hand, and inside, the faint ghost of her perfume lingered near a lock of hair. May put it on, sliding it over her neck. It fit like an answer. He did not tell her the locket's secret. That riveted into its hinge was a sliver of bent wire, a lockpick fashioned small enough to escape notice. He kept the secret because it was a tool and a promise both. She asked him the question that would change everything. If you could go back, would you still become an outlaw? His answer wasn't what anyone expected. "Some men are born outlaws. Others have outlaws born in them," he said quietly. "If I could go back, I'd go back and be a better brother." It was not an apology. It was a ledger and a confession. The line hung like a coin in the air. Pay attention, and the audience felt the pull to choose sides. He'd been asked a moral question aloud, and that question asked the viewers as well. If you could go back, would you still become an outlaw? It was easy to think you'd choose differently until you were the one with blood on your hands. The question begged comment. What would you pick? For a heartbeat, 30 minutes compressed into a single breath, they had a false peace. The sun dipped and painted the canyon red. They shared a small meal and traded stories with the kind of intimacy reserved for people who had decided not to die alone. He spoke of a house he once dreamed of owning, a ridiculous little thing with a porch and a tree, not unlike a child's drawing. She spoke about the river she'd once crossed and the smell of hot bread in a kitchen she couldn't remember cooking in, but could imagine with cruelty. He showed her the photograph from his left pocket. Lydia, laughing at the river, her hair like a flame. He kept touching the left pocket because in it was the receipt from the night they'd tried to bribe a clerk into silence, the evidence that could confuse the sheriff's narrative. The touch was not superstition. It was the weight of proof. He'd kept it there because he didn't trust anyone with the truth, not even himself. The horse outside was restless, stamping the earth, smelling rain or danger. Elias could never tell which. He checked the windows one last time before sitting with May to watch the sunset. For the audience, every old loop whispered in the air. The left pocket, the locket luck, the sheriff's approach. Elias felt the horse's agitation like a guitar string tuned to danger. They were watching the sunset when the first bullet shattered the window. The glass exploded like a star. May yelped as white dust fell on her lashes. He moved like a rope burning hot, hand to gun, shoulder to the breech, 2 steps, and he was standing in the line of fire. Bullets chittered off wood. Boots on the porch announced the arrival of men bearing a law that didn't belong to them. They were under siege. The siege made the world small and exact. The men outside had numbers and ordnance. Inside, they had 2 people, scant ammo, and a refusal to be dragged to death without an exchange. A real-time countdown began. Enemies would attack at dawn. 3 hours until the town found a way to make an example of May. Betrayal cleaved like an axe. His old friend Gideon led the posse. The betrayal was clinical. Gideon walked with the swagger of a man who'd sold his soul in pieces. Elias's plan to surrender himself to save May started as a moral reflection and blossomed into a real possibility. The danger forced a real decision: surrender and maybe save her life, or fight and risk both their deaths. He had 1 bullet left, or so the math of the night suggested. 1 bullet, 2 targets, and the choice that would damn or save them. Inside, they fortified the place with what they had: stacked furniture, nailed shutters, a small cache of rifles. He found, amid the rubble, a list hidden in a cigar tin, names of men who got paid off and an address for a ledger. The outside's voices grew louder, faces press glaring like moths. She found evidence on the sheriff's man, a cufflink with the governor's crest, the same crest of the railroad baron. The web connected. She had to decide whether to trust a man with a 3-bullet promise. The audience watched the open loop. He had 1 bullet left. 2 targets, a choice. The tension threaded through like a wire. When the last dice rolled, it rolled cruel. Gideon stood at the entry with an insolent grin. He had brought the sheriff and the dead partner. One of Elias's allies, old Ben, who had taught him to read stars, died in the first exchange, a lantern of a man whose laugh would not echo again. Old Ben fell like a book closing, and the world lost a warmth. May was captured in the chaos. The men moved like wolves that had found a throat. The world shrank to the hollow between Elias's ribs. He was shot, wounded in the side, and left for dead among the splinters of wood as they hauled May away. Her fingers brushed his face before she was dragged. "Don't let them hang me for a secret that's not mine," she whispered. They took her to town square, where men with ropes are efficient and hungry, for example. The public hanging was set for morning, 24 hours from now, and a hard deadline that pulsed in the night. Elias lay among ruin and bit down on the taste of iron. They thought he was dead. They left him in a pool that was not fully dark. The camera, if there had been one, would have found his eyelids twitching, a pulse in the throat, and the faint sound of him still moving. They thought he was dead. They thought she was helpless. They'd forgotten what made him an outlaw and what she'd learned from him. The story asked the audience a brutal question. He had to choose: save her and become the killer they said he was, or let her die and keep his soul. Which would you decide? The choice was designed to be controversial. There was no easy answer. Elias wasn't dead. He crawled like a man made of wire and stubbornness. Blood made the world sharp. He gathered what he could. 2 men, Tommy and Jeb, former enemies who had owed him favors. 1 horse, half sane, and a plan that was half audacity and half prayer. The plan needed 6 men, 4 horses, and 3 miracles. He had 2 men, 1 horse, and May, who refused to wait for rescue. That refusal made the impossible slightly less impossible. He moved through alleys like a shadow. He called in small debts: an old laundress who owed him a kindness, a saloon girl who once had a reason to trust him enough to pass a note. He forged a forged wagon wheel, pinched a coat, bought time and patience. Meanwhile, May, inside the jail, found the locket he'd given her contained the small lockpick he'd hidden in the hinge. She used it with fingers that shook and then steadied, remembering his teaching about breathing with the tool. The lock clicked like a small freedom. Parallel action wound like a braid. He assembled men who had once cursed him, but now had reasons to pay him back. They hit the town supply house, tied rope, forged orders, and created confusion. A merchant's ledger falsified to look like a mistaken shipment. A back alley where tokens were exchanged, and the sheriff's men were misdirected. Time pressure was real. The execution at midday sheafed the horizon. He had to be precise. He said a line before the raid that would be remembered. "We don't get to be saints today, only sharp." It was terse and savage, and it became a shareable one-liner for the crowd in whatever bar told the tale later. The plan's success hinged on May's own escape, the lockpick in a locket, and an audacity to break the town's habit of believing its own stories. They came in multiple fronts. Elias and his 2 men crashed the square, guns barking like an angry choir. May slipped from the cell and moved through a narrow vent because the sheriff's men were loud and believed themselves clever. The timing was tense, every second a bell, every breath counted. The sky was thin and hard as a coin. Elias battled in the street like a man unmoored. He had, as always, his calculated violence, aimed to disarm and not destroy when he could. Gideon ran like a coward, and men fell like weeds. The governor's cufflink flashed in the sun, and then was gone, dirty in the dust. The sheriff finally met Elias face to face at the railings, and the confrontation split open like a fist. May fought in the inside, her breath shallow, heart like a drum. The locket's secret, its hidden pick, worked. She picked the lock to the gallows box and then heard the world tilt. A scream, a shout, the crowd's attention lured to the square. She moved like a phantom and jammed the block on the exit where the hangman had practiced cruelty. And then she climbed like a woman who had learned to be both small and vast. At the showdown, Gideon faced the consequences he'd spent 3 years avoiding. He had a final poetic justice. A bullet grazed his hand, and his knife slid out of reach. The sheriff, Harrow, had one more trick. He drew a pistol not to kill but to reveal. He had a ledger he'd thought was ironclad, now flipped like a card, exposing his name at last. A witness, a saloon clerk, whose conscience had been traded for favors, stepped forward with proof. The public's roar turned from appetite to doubt. The sheriff pulsed with rage. Elias had to choose again. Kill and end the man who'd made him into a monster, or bring him down with the law he'd always scorned. Elias pulled the trigger, but not at Harrow. He fired a bullet into the rope at the gallows pulley. The snap sent dust and the sheriff's truth into the air. Gideon dropped to his knees, and Harrow, exposed, made a move that would be his undoing. Elias tackled him, the pair rolling like 2 men scrubbing truth from a floor. The struggle was not clean. It was messy and human. In the end, the town that had cheered for spectacle found itself watching one man deliver poetic justice. Harrow was cowed, and Gideon fled. May ran when the crowd's attention fractured and found Elias bruised and bleeding, his hand trembling. She wrapped her arms around him, and he felt for the first time like the outlaw in him had rest. He had used the 3 bullets not to become a monster, but to become necessary. The locket had saved her life. The hidden pick had opened a cage. Gideon had been unmasked. The sheriff had been exposed. The man who took everything faced the outlaw, who had nothing left to lose. Justice had been messy and not perfect, but it was, in the end, earned. 6 months later, the road curved like a sentence. Elias and May rode away at dawn, their new home a place 2 towns over, where men had not heard his name or the price on his head. He changed his hat, the color of it lightening like a secret, and she wore the locket on a thin chain, the pick still hidden in its hinge. They kept moving, because where they'd come from would watch for them forever. The unanswered questions were closed into neat, honest knots. Gideon had been run out of town. Sheriff Harrow had been jailed after the clerk produced ledgers and letters. His authority peeled back to reveal small, hungry hands. The railroad baron had been fined and shamed. His empire had been dented. Lydia, the sister, had been found in a hospital for the poor, alive but sick with the guilt that had shaped every choice. She had begged forgiveness in a desert-sharp voice. Elias forgave her not because he'd forgotten, but because the cost of his life had taught him that forgiveness was the only coin that could buy a small peace. They could not go back to who they'd been. The law in that town had the memory of their faces and would hunt them if they returned. But redemption had a shape that fit them. A small house with a porch, a tree they'd plant in soil for the first time. He built the porch himself, with hands that still trembled sometimes. She learned how to bake bread, burning loaves now and then, laughing at the smallness of everything compared to what they'd escaped. The final image echoed the opening. The same horizon that had once looked like a noose now looked like a road. He had been a wanted man. She had been a witness. Together, they had stolen from a town its appetite for violence and given it a taste of truth. In the end, love had been their law. The closing line, simple and true, hung like a coin in the sun. "Love doesn't follow the rules," Elias said quietly one evening as they watched a young couple walk past their porch. "It writes its own law." And so their story ends where ours begins. In this harsh frontier where justice is scarce and second chances rarer still, love writes its own law. If tales like these speak to the outlaw in your heart, if you believe that even the most wanted soul can find redemption in another's arms, then subscribe to witness more legends where love defies every boundary. Like this story, if you believe love can tame the wildest heart, and share these tales with every soul that beats for forbidden romance. Hit that bell, partner. The frontier's got more stories to tell, and every one of them might just change your heart forever. Drop a comment. Which moment had you holding your breath? Would you have shot Harrow or found another way? What would you do with one bullet and two enemies? They rode away under a sky that would always be watching, and the world kept its stories. Because sometimes the most wanted people are the ones who end up saving us all.